Hello, and welcome to The Long Shadow. In the autumn of 1851, in a modest apartment in Frankfurt am Main, an old man sat surrounded by letters. They had been arriving for months now, these letters, from universities and admirers across Europe. Professors who had never acknowledged his existence were suddenly writing to praise his genius. Young philosophers were making pilgrimages to his door. Portrait painters were requesting sittings. After 4 decades of almost total obscurity, Arthur Schopenhauer had woken up famous. He was 63 years old, his hair had turned white, his health was failing, and he had been waiting for this moment since he was 30. Most people who hear the name Schopenhauer think of pessimism, of a gloomy philosopher who believed life was suffering and the best we could hope for was a kind of resigned acceptance. But there is a deeper story that history rarely tells. Here was a man who published what he believed to be the solution to the riddle of existence at the age of 30, and then watched in bewildered fury as the world completely ignored him. He spent the next 40 years in exile from his own profession, convinced that he was right and that everyone else was wrong. And in the end, impossibly, he was vindicated. The world came to him. How does a person endure 4 decades of rejection while maintaining absolute certainty in their own genius? What sustains such a man, and what does it cost him? To understand Arthur Schopenhauer, to truly grasp both the brilliance and the darkness of the philosopher who would influence Nietzsche, Freud, Wagner, Tolstoy, and countless others, we must travel back to the beginning, not to the fame that arrived too late, but to the world that made him. The year is 1788. The place is a city that no longer exists as it was then, a proud mercantile republic on the Baltic coast. This is the story of the philosopher who waited, and of the long shadow he cast across the modern world. If you are enjoying this journey through history, please take a moment to like this video. It is a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I would love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to the cobblestone streets of Danzig, to a prosperous merchant house, where a child was about to be born into wealth, privilege, and a coldness that would shape everything he became. The city of Danzig in 1788 was one of the great trading ports of the Baltic Sea. It was a free city, not subject to any king, governed by its own council of wealthy merchants. Ships from across Europe crowded its harbour, bringing grain from the Polish interior and carrying it to the hungry markets of the West. The great merchant families lived in tall, narrow houses along the waterfront, their gabled facades rising above streets thick with the smell of salt and commerce. Into this world of trade and calculation, on February 22nd, 1788, Arthur Schopenhauer was born. His father, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, was one of the wealthiest merchants in the city. He was a man of strong opinions and rigid principles, an admirer of English culture, of republican government, and of the philosophy of Voltaire. He had travelled widely across Europe and prided himself on his cosmopolitan outlook. He was also nearly 40 years old when Arthur was born, and he had married a woman half his age. Arthur's mother, Johanna Trosiena, was just 19 when she became Heinrich's wife. She had not married for love. She had married for security, for escape from her father's house, for the promise of a comfortable life. She would later admit this openly, with a frankness that scandalized some and fascinated others. There was no passion in the Schopenhauer household. There was arrangement. There was duty. There was the cold machinery of a practical alliance. The child born into this house would grow up surrounded by every material comfort. He would be educated by the finest tutors, travel across the continent, learn multiple languages, and want for nothing that money could buy. But the one thing money could not purchase was the one thing he would spend his life trying to understand and ultimately trying to escape. He would spend his life thinking about suffering, about desire, about the relentless striving of the human will, and perhaps it began here, in this house of plenty where warmth was the only thing in short supply. But to understand how one of history's most influential thinkers spent 4 decades in exile from his own profession, we must first understand the family that made him. We must understand the father whose ambitions would become Arthur's cage, and the mother whose rejection would become his wound. We must travel back to a city that no longer exists, and to a family whose wealth could buy everything except warmth. Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer was not born into wealth. He had built it himself, inheriting a modest trading business from his father and expanding it through shrewdness, discipline, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. By the time Arthur was born, Heinrich was one of the most respected merchants in Danzig, a man whose word was trusted in counting houses from Amsterdam to St. Petersburg. He was also a deeply unusual man for his time and place. While most German merchants of his era were provincial and conservative, Heinrich cultivated a deliberately cosmopolitan identity. He had spent years living in France and England as a young man, and he returned to Danzig with an abiding admiration for English culture, English liberalism, and English pragmatism. He named his son Arthur specifically because the name worked in German, French, and English. He was thinking even then of the world beyond the Baltic. Heinrich was also a man of the Enlightenment. He read Voltaire. He despised superstition and religious enthusiasm. He believed in reason, in commerce, in the steady improvement of human affairs through education and trade. In an age when most Germans still lived under the arbitrary rule of princes, Heinrich was a committed republican. He believed that free men governing themselves through rational institutions was the highest form of political organisation. These were the values he intended to pass to his son. Arthur would be raised not as a provincial German burgher, but as a citizen of the world, fluent in languages, comfortable in any European capital, prepared to take his place in the great family business. But there was a shadow over Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer that his cosmopolitan Polish could not entirely conceal. He was a man of deep and persistent anxieties. As he aged, these anxieties intensified into something approaching paranoia. He became convinced that enemies were watching him, that his business rivals were plotting against him. He grew increasingly suspicious of servants, of associates, of anyone outside his immediate family. His hearing began to fail in his later years, and this only deepened his sense of isolation and threat. Those who knew Heinrich in his final years described a man who had withdrawn into himself, who trusted no one, who seemed to be fighting battles that existed only in his own mind. It was a pattern that would reappear with terrible clarity in his son. But in the years of Arthur's childhood, Heinrich was still a vigorous and commanding presence. He ruled his household with the same discipline he brought to his business. There would be no softness in Arthur's upbringing. There would be no indulgence. The boy would be shaped into something useful, something practical, something worthy of the Schopenhauer name. Johanna, for her part, found herself increasingly unhappy in her marriage. She was a young woman of intelligence and literary ambition trapped in a union with a man old enough to be her father, a man who showed her respect but not affection, security but not love. She had married to escape one cage and found herself in another, more comfortable but no less confining. She would later write about these years with a detachment that borders on the chilling. She described her marriage as a practical arrangement in which both parties understood their roles. She described her husband as a good man but not an easy one. She rarely wrote about her feelings for her son at all. The household that Arthur Schopenhauer grew up in was materially abundant and emotionally barren. His father was preoccupied with business and increasingly lost in his own anxieties. His mother was present but distant, already dreaming of the literary life she would eventually pursue. The servants were efficient but could not provide what parents would not. It was in this atmosphere, surrounded by wealth and silence, that Arthur Schopenhauer's mind began to form. He was a serious child, given to long silences and intense observation. He watched the ships come and go in the harbour. He listened to his father's business conversations. He noticed even then the gap between what people said and what they seemed to feel. The world he was beginning to understand was not quite what it appeared to be. There was something beneath the surface, something that drove people to act in ways they themselves did not fully understand. It would take him decades to find the words for this intuition, but the seed was planted here, in the cold prosperity of a Danzig merchant house. Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer believed he was preparing his son for greatness. He could not have known that the education he designed would become both Arthur's salvation and his curse. When Arthur was 5 years old, his father made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. Heinrich had always feared the growing power of Prussia, the aggressive military kingdom that had been slowly absorbing the smaller German states. In 1793, his fears were realized. Prussia annexed the free city of Danzig. The proud mercantile republic that had governed itself for centuries was suddenly subject to a king. Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer refused to live under a monarch. He liquidated his considerable business interests, packed up his family and moved to the free city of Hamburg. It was a dramatic gesture of principle, and it cost him a significant portion of his fortune. But Heinrich would not bend. He would remain a free man in a free city, or he would not remain at all. For young Arthur, the move meant upheaval. He had known no home but Danzig. Now, at 5 years old, he was transplanted to a new city, a new house, a new life. It was the first of many. Dislocations, the first lesson in the impermanence of all things. But Heinrich had larger plans for his son than mere comfort. He intended to give Arthur an education that would make him a true citizen of the world, and he began this education with a remarkable experiment. When Arthur was 9 years old, Heinrich sent him to live with a family friend in Le Havre, France. The boy would spend 2 full years there, immersed in French language and culture. He would attend school with French children. He would learn to think and dream in a foreign tongue. It was an extraordinary opportunity and an extraordinary burden for a 9-year-old child. Arthur was sent away from his family, from everything familiar, to live among strangers in a foreign land. He adapted as children do. He became fluent in French. He made friends. He explored the harbour town, watched the ships, developed his powers of observation. But when he returned to Hamburg 2 years later, he found that he had become a stranger in his own home. His German was rusty. His parents had become unfamiliar. His younger sister Adele, born during his absence, was a stranger to him. The boy who came back from France was not quite the boy who had left. Something had shifted. He had learned, at a very young age, how to be alone. Heinrich was pleased with the results. His son was now bilingual, cultured, adaptable. The experiment had worked. He decided to expand it. In 1803, when Arthur was 15, Heinrich announced that the entire family would embark on a grand tour of Europe. They would travel for nearly 2 years, visiting Holland, England, France, Switzerland, and Austria. They would see the great cities of the continent. They would observe foreign customs and foreign peoples. It was the kind of education that only the wealthy could afford, and Heinrich was determined that his son would have it. But there was a condition. This would not be a pleasure trip, it would be a practical education. Arthur was required to keep detailed journals, not of cathedrals and paintings, but of factories and prisons, of commercial practices and social conditions. He was being trained to see the world as a merchant sees it, as a series of opportunities and obstacles, of systems to be understood and exploited. While his parents attended salons and theatres, enjoyed the social life of the European capitals, Arthur was often left alone in hotels with only his notebooks for company. He dutifully recorded what he saw. He described the famous sights, but his private feelings about this arrangement he kept to himself. There is something melancholy in the picture of this serious, observant boy, trailing through the great cities of Europe with his parents, always watching, always noting, always somehow apart. He was being given every advantage, and he was utterly alone. The grand tour covered thousands of miles. Arthur saw the bustle of London, the elegance of Paris, the mountains of Switzerland. He improved his English, already competent from his father's tutelage, until he could read and write it with ease. He developed the polyglot facility that would later allow him to read philosophy in 5 languages. But something else happened on that journey, something that would haunt him. In England, Arthur witnessed scenes of human suffering so stark that he would later claim they planted the first seeds of his famous pessimism. What he saw there would change how he understood the world and what lay beneath its civilized surface. The England that Arthur Schopenhauer encountered in 1803 was a nation of stark contrasts. It was the wealthiest country in the world, the heart of a growing empire, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. It was also a place of terrible poverty, brutal punishment, and human misery, on a scale the young German had never witnessed. Heinrich's educational program required Arthur to observe social conditions, and observe he did. But what he saw was not the triumph of English commerce. What he saw was its cost. He was taken to see the prison hulks in the Thames, decommissioned warships converted into floating prisons, where convicts awaited transportation to Australia. He saw men in chains, crowded into rotting wooden holds, living in conditions that were barely human. The sight stayed with him. Decades later, he would write about those prison ships as one of the formative experiences of his youth. He witnessed public executions. In early 19th century England, hanging was still a public spectacle, carried out before crowds that gathered as if for entertainment. The young Arthur watched as men were led to the gallows and dropped to their deaths, while the crowd cheered or jeered. He saw the casual brutality of it, the way suffering had been transformed into spectacle, and he saw the slums. The emerging industrial cities of England were producing wealth at an unprecedented rate, but that wealth was not evenly distributed. The workers who powered the factories lived in conditions of desperate poverty, crowded into filthy tenements, working 18-hour days, sending their children into the mines and mills. Arthur walked through these neighbourhoods. He recorded what he saw. Something shifted in him during those English months. The comfortable certainties of his merchant upbringing began to crack. He had been raised to believe in progress, in the rational improvement of human affairs, in the essential goodness of commerce and civilization. But what he was seeing told a different story. The world was not getting better for everyone. The price of progress was paid in human suffering, and the bill was presented to those least able to afford it. He would later describe this period as the beginning of his philosophical awakening. The questions that would define his life's work, questions about suffering, about the nature of existence, about what lay beneath the surface of human striving, began to form in the mind of this 15-year-old boy standing in the shadow of English gallows. But there was a more immediate crisis brewing. Heinrich had not brought his son to Europe to make him a philosopher. He had brought him to prepare him for the family business. And now, as the grand tour drew to a close, he presented Arthur with a choice. The terms were stark. Arthur could accept an apprenticeship with a prominent Hamburg merchant, learn the trade, and eventually inherit his father's business and fortune. Or he could pursue the education he was beginning to desire, study at a university, and follow his intellectual inclinations. But if he chose the second path, he would receive nothing, no support, no inheritance. He would be on his own. It was an impossible choice for a 15-year-old. On one side was security, wealth, the approval of his father, a clear path through life. On the other was uncertainty, poverty, and the vague dream of something more. Arthur looked at his father, at this man who had given him everything except warmth, who had shaped him and educated him, and never once asked what he actually wanted. He looked at his mother, who seemed indifferent to the outcome. He thought about the prison hulks and the gallows and the slums, and he chose safety. He agreed to become a merchant. It was a decision he would bitterly regret for years. But at 15, facing his father's implacable will and his mother's cool detachment, he did not see another way. He entered the world of commerce in 1799 with a heart full of resentment. Within 6 years, an unexpected death would set him free, but freedom, he would discover, carries its own terrible weight. The years of Arthur's commercial apprenticeship were years of quiet desperation. He worked in the offices of a Hamburg merchant, learning the trade his father had chosen for him. He kept ledgers, he wrote letters, he performed the endless small tasks that commerce requires, and he hated every moment of it. His letters from this period reveal a young man in profound distress. He felt trapped. He felt that his true nature was being crushed by the weight of duty and expectation. He watched his youth slipping away in counting houses and warehouses, while the life of the mind, the life he craved, remained forever out of reach. Heinrich, meanwhile, was deteriorating. The anxieties that had always troubled him were intensifying year by year. His hearing had failed almost completely. He had become paranoid, suspicious, withdrawn. He spent more and more time alone in his study, obsessing over imagined threats to his business and his family. Johanna had long since given up any pretense of emotional connection to her husband. She went through the motions of marriage, but her heart was elsewhere. She had discovered that she had a talent for writing, for conversation, for the social arts. She dreamed of a different life, a life of salons and literary society, a life that Hamburg and Heinrich could not provide. The household that had always been cold was now actively poisonous. Arthur's apprenticeship dragged on. His resentment grew. His father's mental state declined. His mother's detachment became more pronounced. And then, on April 20th, 1805, everything changed. Heinrich Florist Schopenhauer's body was found in the canal behind his Hamburg warehouse. He had apparently fallen from an upper-floor storage loft. He was 65 years old. The official verdict was accident. Heinrich had been in the warehouse inspecting inventory. He had been alone. Perhaps he had stumbled. Perhaps his failing hearing had caused him to misjudge his position near the edge. Perhaps. But the whispers were immediate and persistent. Heinrich had been increasingly unstable. His paranoia had grown severe. His isolation was almost total. Those who knew him in his final months had seen a man at war with demons that existed only in his own mind. Had he jumped? Had he deliberately ended a life that had become unbearable? The question was never officially answered. It hung over the family like a cloud, unspoken but ever present. For Arthur, the news was shattering in ways that were difficult to untangle. He had resented his father for years, had blamed him for the cage of commercial life, had dreamed of escape, and now escape had come, but at a price he'd never imagined paying. He was free. The apprenticeship was over. His father's will left him a share of the family fortune, enough to live on if he was careful. He could now pursue the education he had always wanted. The path to philosophy was open, but the guilt was overwhelming. He had wished for this. Not his father's death, perhaps, but the freedom that death had brought. He had dreamed of escape, and escape had come wrapped in tragedy. How could he enjoy his liberation when it had been purchased with his father's life? And there was something else. Something darker. Arthur had inherited more than money from Heinrich Florist Schopenhauer. He had inherited the anxieties, the paranoid tendencies, the capacity for depression that had plagued his father. He would fight these demons his entire life. He would see his father's face in the mirror and wonder if he was destined for the same end. The death of Heinrich marked the end of Arthur's youth and the beginning of his true life. But before he could step into that life, before he could begin the philosophical journey that would consume him, he had to survive something perhaps even more difficult than his father's death. He had to survive his mother. Arthur Schopenhauer was now wealthy, fatherless and free. But before he could begin his new life, he would have to survive the woman who had never wanted to be his mother. In the months following Heinrich's death, Johanna Schopenhauer made a decision that revealed everything about her priorities. She gathered her share of the family fortune, took her young daughter Adele, and left Hamburg for Weimar. Weimar was the intellectual capital of Germany, home to the giants of German letters. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe lived there. Friedrich Schiller had recently died there. The small ducal city attracted poets, philosophers, and artists from across the German-speaking world. It was everything Hamburg was not: cultured, literary, alive with ideas. Johanna reinvented herself completely. She established a salon that became one of the most celebrated in Weimar. She began writing novels that achieved considerable popular success. She cultivated a friendship with the great Goethe himself, who became a regular visitor to her Thursday evening gatherings. Within a few years, Johanna Schopenhauer was a literary celebrity, more famous in her lifetime than her son would ever be in his. She did not invite Arthur to join her. The 17-year-old was left in Hamburg to settle his father's affairs and complete his transition out of the commercial world. When he finally did visit Weimar, the visits were disasters. Mother and son were fundamentally incompatible. Where Johanna was sociable, Arthur was solitary. Where she valued charm and wit, he valued depth and truth. Where she sought pleasure and distraction, he sought meaning. Their arguments were legendary. Arthur would arrive at his mother's salon and immediately begin criticizing her guests, her ideas, her entire way of life. He would lecture the assembled company on philosophy, correcting their errors with a bluntness that bordered on cruelty. He would sulk when his opinions were not given sufficient weight. He would storm out when contradicted. Johanna found him exhausting. She wrote to him in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. She told him that his presence in her house made everyone uncomfortable. She told him that his gloomy disposition and argumentative manner drove away her friends. She told him that she loved him, in her way, but that she could not endure living with him. The letters between mother and son from this period make painful reading. Arthur craved her approval and her love. Johanna was incapable of providing either. She saw in her son everything she had tried to escape from: the heaviness, the melancholy, the relentless seriousness of his father. She had built a new life for herself in Weimar, a life of lightness and literature and social success. Arthur threatened to drag her back into the darkness. The breaking point came during one of Arthur's visits. The exact details are disputed, but the outcome is not. During a heated argument, Johanna pushed her son down a flight of stairs. Whether this was a violent shove or a moment of frustrated physical contact that went wrong, the effect was the same. Arthur left his mother's house and never returned while she was alive. Johanna wrote him a final letter. It is a document of chilling clarity. She told him that she was his mother, and that nothing could change that biological fact. She told him that she wished him well and hoped for his success, but she also told him that she could not bear his company, that his very presence made her miserable, that she was not willing to sacrifice her happiness for the obligations of motherhood. They did not speak again for 24 years. Johanna lived until 1838. Arthur did not attend her funeral. When he learned of her death, his response was characteristically complex. He mourned, in his way. He also began collecting her letters, preserving the evidence of her rejection with an almost scholarly detachment. The wound never healed. Arthur Schopenhauer would spend his life struggling with women, with intimacy, with the very possibility of human connection. His later writings on women would become notorious for their bitterness and hostility. Scholars have debated for 2 centuries how much of his famous misogyny was philosophy, and how much was unprocessed pain. What is certain is that Johanna's rejection shaped her son in ways that went beyond personal unhappiness. It confirmed his growing intuition that the world was not a place of love and connection, but of will and striving, of individuals pursuing their own interests with little regard for those who stood in their way, even mothers, perhaps especially mothers. Rejected by his mother and freed from his father's expectations, Arthur Schopenhauer finally possessed what he had always wanted: the freedom to pursue philosophy. But the university world he was about to enter would prove just as hostile as the home he had left behind. In the autumn of 1809, Arthur Schopenhauer enrolled at the University of Göttingen. He was 21 years old, finally free to pursue the education his father had denied him, and burning with an intensity that would mark everything he did for the rest of his life. He had chosen Göttingen for its reputation in the sciences. His initial plan was to study medicine, a practical field that might satisfy any lingering guilt about abandoning the commercial path his father had intended. But from the very first weeks he found himself drawn to the philosophy lectures. He attended them unofficially at first, then with growing obsession. By the end of his first semester, medicine had been abandoned entirely. Philosophy had claimed him. The professor who captured his imagination was Gottlob Ernst Schulze, a scholar of considerable reputation who introduced his students to the great traditions of Western thought. It was Schulze who first placed in Arthur's hands the works that would shape his entire philosophical development. He told his brilliant young student to read Plato and Kant before touching anything else. Everything of importance in philosophy, Schulze insisted, flowed from these two sources. Arthur took the advice with characteristic intensity. He read Plato's dialogues in the original Greek and felt as if he were discovering a secret language, a way of thinking that cut beneath the surface of ordinary experience. He read Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and experienced something close to revelation. Kant's great work is one of the most difficult texts in Western philosophy. It is dense, technical, written in a style that seems designed to repel casual readers. Many students bounced off it, defeated by its complexity. Arthur devoured it. He read it not once, but multiple times, annotating his copies with notes that survive to this day. He later described the experience as a veil being lifted from his eyes. Kant had shown him that the world, as we perceive it, is not the world as it truly is. Our minds construct reality according to their own categories and limitations. The thing in itself, the reality behind appearances, remains forever hidden from direct perception. This insight would become the foundation of Arthur's own philosophy. But where Kant had declared the thing in itself unknowable, Arthur would eventually claim to have identified it. That bold move was still years away, for now he was a student, absorbing everything he could. Göttingen gave Arthur his philosophical foundation, but it was not enough. He wanted to study with the greatest minds of his generation. In 1811, he transferred to the University of Berlin, drawn by the presence of Johann Gottlieb Fichte, then the most celebrated philosopher in Germany. Fichte was a titan. He had been a student of Kant's and had developed his own elaborate philosophical system, a form of idealism that placed the creative ego at the centre of reality. Students flocked to his lectures. His fame was enormous. Arthur arrived expecting to sit at the feet of a master. What he found instead was disappointment so profound it curdled into contempt. Arthur attended Fichte's lectures faithfully, at least at first. He sat in the back of the crowded hall and listened as the great man held forth on the nature of consciousness and the absolute ego. And he could not understand what Fichte was talking about, not because the ideas were too complex for him, but because they seemed to Arthur fundamentally empty. They were words chasing words, elaborate verbal constructions with no anchor in reality. He began to take notes in the margins of his lecture notebooks, notes that were not summaries but refutations. He mocked Fichte's arguments. He questioned his premises. He accused him, in the privacy of those marginalia, of being a charlatan, a man who mistook obscurity for depth. These notes survive, and they reveal a young man of ferocious, intellectual confidence, utterly convinced that he could see what the famous professor could not. This pattern would define Arthur Schopenhauer's career. He was brilliant, uncompromising, and constitutionally incapable of hiding his disdain for those he considered intellectual frauds. It was a stance that would win him admirers in the centuries to come. It would also guarantee that he would spend most of his life alone. In Berlin, Schopenhauer discovered not just philosophy, but also his first true intellectual enemy. It was a pattern of rivalry that would culminate decades later in a battle with the most powerful philosopher in Germany. That confrontation would cost him everything. Despite the bitter estrangement from his mother, Arthur Schopenhauer found himself drawn back to Weimar in the years following his studies. The reason was not Johanna. The reason was the most famous man in Germany. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was 70 years old when Arthur first entered his orbit. He was a living legend, the author of Faust and the Sorrows of Young Werther, a poet and playwright whose reputation extended across all of Europe. He was also a scientist, a statesman, and the cultural centre around which all of Weimar revolved. To know Goethe was to touch greatness itself. The connection came through Johanna's salon. Despite their personal estrangement, mother and son moved in overlapping social circles when Arthur visited Weimar. Goethe attended Johanna's gatherings. He had heard of her difficult, brilliant son. When they were introduced, the old poet found himself intrigued by the intensity of the young philosopher. What drew them together was an unlikely subject: the theory of colour. Goethe had spent decades developing his own theory of how colours are perceived, a theory that contradicted the established Newtonian view. It was his personal obsession, the scientific work he valued even above his literary achievements. Most scientists dismissed it, but Goethe believed passionately that he had discovered something important about the nature of perception. Arthur was fascinated. Colour theory might seem far removed from metaphysics, but for a philosopher interested in how the mind constructs reality, it was directly relevant. He and Goethe spent hours discussing the subject. Arthur eventually wrote his own treatise on colour, on vision and colours, which both complemented and challenged Goethe's work. The relationship between them was complex. Goethe was generous with his time and encouragement. He recognised in Arthur a genuine philosophical talent, a mind capable of going beyond what had come before. He read Arthur's early work with care and offered praise that meant everything to the young man starved for paternal approval. But Goethe was also honest. He saw what others saw in Arthur Schopenhauer: the brilliance, but also the abrasiveness, the social clumsiness, the inability to modulate his intensity for ordinary human interaction. Goethe warned him, gently but clearly, that his manner would bring him enemies. Philosophy was not conducted in isolation. It required engagement with other thinkers, with institutions, with the social world of academia. A man who could not control his contempt would find every door closed against him. Arthur listened, or appeared to listen. He valued Goethe's opinion more than that of anyone else alive. The old poet was the closest thing to a father figure he had ever found. A man who combined intellectual greatness with a warmth that Heinrich Florist Schopenhauer had never possessed. In Goethe's presence, Arthur was capable of something resembling humility, but he did not truly absorb the warning. He believed that truth would triumph on its own merits. He believed that genuine philosophy would be recognized regardless of how it was presented or by whom. He believed, in the way that young men of great ability often believe, that the ordinary rules did not apply to him. Goethe recognized this blindness. He admired Arthur's gifts while fearing for his future. The young philosopher had the mind to change the world. He also had the personality to ensure that the world would refuse to listen. Their friendship continued, though it cooled somewhat as Arthur's treatise on colour failed to bring him the recognition he expected. Goethe remained supportive but increasingly distant, occupied with his own final works. They would never be as close again as they were in those early years of collaboration. Goethe told the young philosopher that his ideas were brilliant, but his manner would bring him enemies. Schopenhauer dismissed the warning as the caution of old age. Within 5 years, he would stake everything on a single book and discover exactly what Goethe had meant. In 1814, Arthur Schopenhauer retreated to the city of Dresden. He was 26 years old, and he had come to write the book that would, he believed, solve the riddle of existence. Dresden was a city of beauty and culture, but Arthur had not come for its galleries or its society. He rented modest rooms and withdrew into almost complete isolation. For the next 4 years, he He would live like a monk devoted to a single holy text, except that the text was his own and the religion was philosophy. The work consumed him. He wrote in the mornings, walked in the afternoons to clear his mind, and spent his evenings reading and revising. He corresponded with few people. He attended no salons. The social world that his mother had embraced so enthusiastically held no interest for him. Only the book mattered. What Arthur was attempting was breathtakingly ambitious. He intended to synthesize Kantian metaphysics with insights drawn from Plato, from the Upanishads and Buddhist thought that he had recently discovered, and from his own penetrating observations of human psychology. He intended to explain not just how we know the world, but what the world fundamentally is. His answer was the will. Kant had argued that the thing in itself, the reality behind appearances, is unknowable. Arthur disagreed. We do have access to the thing in itself, he claimed, but not through perception or reason. We have access to it through our own bodies. When we move our arm, when we feel hunger or desire, we experience the inner nature of reality directly. That inner nature is will, a blind, purposeless striving that underlies all of existence. The entire universe, Arthur argued, is the manifestation of this will. Every force of nature, every living creature, every human desire is the will expressing itself in the world of appearances. Our individual wills are not separate from this cosmic force. They are its local manifestations. The separation between self and world is an illusion, created by our perceiving minds. But here was the crucial insight that would earn Arthur his reputation as a pessimist. The will is insatiable. It strives endlessly, achieving momentary satisfactions that immediately give way to new desires. Human life is therefore an oscillation between suffering, when we want something we do not have, and boredom, when we have achieved our desires and find them empty. True happiness is impossible because the will can never be permanently satisfied. This was a diagnosis of existence more radical than anything in Western philosophy. It anticipated the evolutionary theory that Darwin would publish decades later. It prefigured the psychology of unconscious drives that Freud would develop a century later. It spoke directly to the experience of human life in a way that academic philosophy had long forgotten how to do. Arthur completed the manuscript in 1818. He titled it The World as Will and Representation. He was 30 years old, and he believed he had achieved something that would change the course of human thought. The book was published later that year by a Leipzig firm. Arthur sent copies to Goethe and to every philosopher and intellectual he could think of. He waited for the world to recognize his genius. The response was silence. The first edition consisted of 500 copies. It took 16 years to sell them. Reviews, when they came at all, were brief and dismissive. The academic establishment ignored the work entirely. The publisher eventually went bankrupt, and the remaining copies of The World as Will and Representation were sold as waste paper. Arthur was devastated. He had poured 4 years of his life into this book. He had sacrificed everything for it, and the world did not care. It was as if he had shouted into a void and received not even an echo in return. The failure of his masterpiece might have broken another man, but Schopenhauer possessed something dangerous, absolute certainty that he was right and the world was wrong. This conviction would sustain him through decades of obscurity. It would also lead him into a confrontation with the most powerful philosopher in Germany, a man whose very name Schopenhauer would eventually refuse to speak. In the same year that Arthur Schopenhauer published his masterpiece To Universal Indifference, another philosopher arrived at the University of Berlin to assume the most prestigious chair of philosophy in Germany. His name was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and he would become the dominant intellectual force of the age. Hegel was everything Schopenhauer was not. Where Arthur was isolated and ignored, Hegel was celebrated and surrounded by disciples. Where Arthur wrote in clear, accessible prose, Hegel cultivated a style so obscure that even his admirers struggled to penetrate it. Where Arthur saw existence as fundamentally irrational, driven by a blind and purposeless will, Hegel saw history as the progressive unfolding of reason itself, a grand dialectical process moving inevitably toward freedom and self-consciousness. The contrast between their philosophies could not have been more complete. For Hegel, reality was rational. The apparent chaos and suffering of existence were merely stages in a larger process of development. History had a direction. Progress was real. The universe made sense. For Schopenhauer, this was not philosophy. It was fantasy dressed in impenetrable jargon. It was wish fulfillment masquerading as metaphysics. Hegel, in Arthur's view, was telling people what they wanted to hear, that their lives had meaning, that their suffering served a purpose, that everything would work out in the end. It was a comfortable lie that made the philosopher rich and famous while the truth gathered dust on bookshop shelves. Arthur's hatred of Hegel was not merely intellectual. It was personal, visceral, lifelong. He called Hegel a charlatan, a clumsy and stupid philosopher, a scribbler of nonsense. He accused him of deliberately obscuring his meaning to create the illusion of profundity. He blamed him for corrupting an entire generation of German thinkers. In later years, he would refuse to speak Hegel's name, referring to him only with contemptuous epithets. But beneath the vitriol was something else. There was envy. There was wounded pride. There was the anguish of watching a man Arthur considered his intellectual inferior achieve everything Arthur had been denied. Hegel's lectures at Berlin drew hundreds of students. They filled the largest halls the university could provide. Young philosophers from across Germany came to sit at his feet. His ideas shaped government policy. His books were discussed in every salon in Berlin. He was, by any external measure, the most successful philosopher of his generation. And Arthur Schopenhauer, who believed he had written the truth about existence, could not sell 500 copies of his book. The rivalry was asymmetrical in a way that made it even more painful. Hegel barely knew that Schopenhauer existed. He had not read The World as Will and Representation. He had no reason to consider the obscure author of an ignored book to be a threat. The battle that consumed Schopenhauer's life was, for Hegel, not a battle at all. This made the hatred burn even hotter. To be defeated by an enemy who does not even recognize you as an opponent is a particular kind of humiliation. Arthur could not compete with Hegel in the arena of academic reputation. He could not match his institutional power, his public fame, his army of devoted students. He could only rage in private, convinced that history would eventually vindicate him, and perhaps that conviction was what drove him to make the most reckless decision of his career. If he could not defeat Hegel from the outside, he would confront him directly. He would enter the arena himself. In 1820, Schopenhauer decided to take the battle directly to Hegel's doorstep. He applied for a teaching position at the University of Berlin itself, and made a decision so driven by pride that it would haunt him for the rest of his career. In the spring of 1820, Arthur Schopenhauer received an appointment as a privet dozent at the University of Berlin. It was an unpaid position. His income would come from fees paid directly by students who attended his lectures. He would have to attract an audience to survive. He knew this. He also knew that his great rival Hegel lectured at the same university, drawing enormous crowds to his courses. The sensible strategy would have been to schedule his own lectures at different times, avoiding direct competition while building his reputation slowly. Schopenhauer did not choose the sensible strategy. He deliberately scheduled his lectures at the exact same time as Hegel's. It was an act of astonishing arrogance, a declaration of war. He believed that students, given the choice between truth and falsehood, would recognize genuine philosophy when they heard it. They would abandon the fraud across the hall and flock to the man who had actually solved the riddle of existence. This was not how it worked. On the first day of Arthur's lectures, he stood before a nearly empty room. A handful of students had come, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps as a courtesy to the new instructor. Across the corridor, Hegel's lecture hall was packed to overflowing. Arthur delivered his lecture anyway. He spoke about the will, about the nature of representation, about the insights that had cost him years of labour and solitude. He spoke to rows of empty chairs. The second lecture was the same, and the third. Students who had tried his course drifted away. They found his intensity off-putting, his disdain for other philosophers alienating. They returned to Hegel, whose obscurity at least had the virtue of being fashionable. By the end of his first semester, Schopenhauer had effectively given up. He never completed a full course of lectures at Berlin. He never attracted more than a handful of students. The confrontation he'd engineered ended not with his triumph, but with his humiliation. He tried to explain the failure to himself. The students were fools. The university was corrupt. Hegel's influence had poisoned the entire institution against genuine philosophy. The system was designed to reward charlatans and punish truth-tellers. There was perhaps some truth in these explanations. Academic philosophy has always had its fashions and its politics. Outsiders with unconventional ideas have always struggled against established powers. But these explanations also serve to protect Arthur from a more painful possibility, that his manner, his personality, his utter inability to connect with other human beings had contributed to his failure. Goethe had warned him. His mother had told him explicitly that people could not bear his company. Everyone who knew him saw what he could not see in himself. The brilliance was real. So was the darkness that surrounded it. The empty classroom marked the end of Schopenhauer's academic career. He would never stand before students again. He would never hold a university position. The institutional world of German philosophy had rejected him, and he in turn would reject it, spending the rest of his life as an independent scholar, answerable to no one, connected to no one. But before he could fully retreat into his solitary existence, he would commit an act that revealed the darkest aspects of his character, an act of violence against a woman who had the misfortune of making noise outside his door. Schopenhauer retreated from Berlin convinced that the world was not ready for his truth, but the world was about to present him with a different kind of test, not of his intellect, but of his character. And this time, the failure would not be academic. It would be moral. Caroline Louise Marquet was a 47-year-old seamstress who worked in the Berlin apartment building where Arthur Schopenhauer lived during his failed attempt at an academic career. She was not a philosopher. She was not concerned with metaphysics or the nature of existence. She was a working woman who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the summer of 1821, Marquet was sitting outside Schopenhauer's door with two other women. They were talking, perhaps loudly. They may have been sewing or conducting the ordinary business of their trade. The details of their conversation have been lost to history. What we know is that Arthur Schopenhauer found their presence intolerable. He was trying to work. He was trying to think. He was, as always, consumed by his philosophical project, the project that the world refused to recognize. And here were these women, chattering outside his door, violating the silence he required. He demanded that they leave. They refused. He demanded again, more forcefully. Marquet stood her ground. She had a right to be there. She was conducting her business. She was not going to be ordered about by an arrogant philosopher. What happened next was witnessed, and would later be described in court testimony. Arthur Schopenhauer physically seized Caroline Marquet and threw her down the stairs. She fell hard. She sustained injuries that she would claim left her right arm permanently impaired. The philosopher's response to the incident was characteristic. He denied any wrongdoing. He insisted that Marquet had been the aggressor, that he had merely defended his right to quiet enjoyment of his lodgings. He showed no remorse, no recognition that he might have crossed a line that civilized people do not cross. Marquet sued. The case wound through the Berlin courts for years. In 1827, the court finally ruled in her favour. Arthur Schopenhauer was ordered to pay Caroline Marquet a quarterly pension for as long as she lived. It was a substantial sum, a constant drain on his resources and a permanent reminder of his violence. He paid. He had no choice. but he paid with bitterness, recording each payment in his ledger with evident resentment. When Caroline Marquet finally died in 1846, after 25 years of receiving his money, Schopenhauer wrote a notation in his ledger that has become infamous. "Obit anus, abit onus," he wrote. "The old woman dies, the burden is lifted." It is a chilling moment. Here was a man who had written eloquently about compassion, who had argued that morality is grounded in our recognition of the suffering of others, who had condemned cruelty in all its forms, and yet he could describe the death of a woman he had injured with nothing more than cold satisfaction at being relieved of a financial obligation. The Marquet incident was not just a scandal, it was a revelation. The philosopher who wrote about the universality of suffering was capable of causing it without remorse. The man who analysed the illusions of the ego with such precision could not see past his own arrogance. The gap between his philosophy and his character was vast, and it raises questions that his admirers have been trying to answer ever since. Can we separate the thinker from the man? Can insights into the nature of existence compensate for failures of basic human decency? Does it matter that the philosopher of compassion was himself incapable of it? These questions have no easy answers. What is certain is that the Marquet case followed Schopenhauer for the rest of his life. It damaged his already fragile reputation. It gave his enemies ammunition, and it revealed something about the man behind the philosophy that he would have preferred to keep hidden. The Marquet case was not just a scandal, it was a revelation. The philosopher who wrote about compassion as the foundation of ethics had shown himself capable of cruelty, and in the decades to come. His writings on women would reveal a bitterness so intense that it still provokes debate today. But first, Schopenhauer had to survive the plague that was about to sweep through Berlin, a plague that would claim his great enemy and reshape his destiny. In the spring of 1831, death came to Berlin in the form of a disease that had never before reached so far into Europe. Cholera had originated in India and had spread westward along trade routes, leaving tens of thousands of corpses in its wake. Now it was at the gates of Germany's capital. Arthur Schopenhauer had always been obsessed with his health. He avoided crowds. He worried about contagion. He slept with loaded pistols beside his bed, afraid of intruders. His paranoia, inherited from his father, made him hyper-vigilant to threats both real and imagined. When news of cholera reached him, he did not hesitate. He packed his belongings and fled Berlin for Frankfurt am Main, a commercial city in the west that seemed safer from the advancing plague. He would never return to the city of his humiliation. The cholera did reach Berlin that summer. It swept through the cramped tenements and the grand houses alike. It killed thousands, and in November of 1831, it claimed its most famous victim, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the most powerful philosopher in Germany, the man whose lectures had filled the halls while Schopenhauer spoke to empty chairs, the enemy whose very name Arthur could barely bring himself to pronounce, died of cholera at the age of 61. The news reached Schopenhauer in Frankfurt. One might expect that he would have felt vindication, even joy. His great rival was gone. The man who had stood between him and recognition had been removed from the stage. But the reality was more complicated. Hegel's death did not weaken his influence. It strengthened it. The man became a martyr. His philosophy, already dominant, became enshrined. His followers, now grieving disciples, worked tirelessly to preserve and extend his legacy. Hegel's system was treated with a reverence that made criticism almost impossible. To attack Hegel now was to attack a saint. Schopenhauer had hoped that his rival's death would clear a path. Instead, it raised a monument that would block him for decades to come. The living Hegel had been an obstacle. The dead Hegel was immovable. Arthur found himself in Frankfurt am Main, a city of bankers and merchants, far from the academic centres where philosophy was debated. He was 43 years old. His masterpiece remained unread. His academic career was over before it had properly begun. His great enemy was dead but more powerful than ever. He had enough money to live on, carefully managed from his share of his father's estate. He did not need to work. He did not need to teach. He was entirely free and entirely alone. It was in Frankfurt that Arthur Schopenhauer would spend the remaining 3 decades of his life. He settled into an apartment and began to construct a routine of almost monastic regularity. He would rise at the same hour, write at the same desk, walk the same paths, dine at the same restaurant, and wait. He never stopped believing that recognition would come. He never doubted the value of what he'd written. He simply accepted with a kind of grim patience that the world was not yet ready to hear what he had to say. Perhaps it would never be ready. Perhaps he would die in obscurity, his books forgotten, his insights lost. But he would not compromise. He would not soften his philosophy to make it more palatable. He would not court the favour of the academic establishment. He would simply continue to think, to write, to refine his ideas in the silence of his Frankfurt apartment, and the world would continue to ignore him. Arthur Schopenhauer arrived in Frankfurt am Main in 1831 at the age of 43. He would live there for 29 years, following the same routine, walking the same streets, dining at the same restaurant, and waiting. Always waiting for the world to discover what he already knew. But what the world did not know was that, hidden in those decades of silence, Schopenhauer was still writing. And his next work would contain some of his most provocative and troubling ideas. To the citizens of Frankfurt am Main, he was a peculiar fixture of the city. This elderly gentleman with his shock of white hair and his invariable routine. They saw him every day, walking the same streets at the same hours, his poodle trotting beside him, his expression fixed in what appeared to be permanent disapproval. The shopkeepers knew him. The waiters at the Englischer Hof knew him. The other diners who shared his table in the communal dining room knew him, though few dared to engage him in conversation more than once. Arthur Schopenhauer had become a creature of absolute habit. He rose each morning at 7, no matter the season. He washed in cold water, a practice he believed essential for health. He drank strong coffee and sat at his desk to write until noon, surrounded by books in German, English, French, Italian, Latin, and Greek. At 12, he set aside his work and took up his flute. For exactly 30 minutes, he played, badly by most accounts, but with evident pleasure. It was the only form of artistic expression he allowed himself. Then came the walk to the Englischer Hof, one of Frankfurt's better hotels, where he took his midday meal at the same table, at the same time, ordering the same dishes with the same instructions to the long-suffering waiters. He ate alone, or rather, he sat among others, but remained alone, reading the London Times, which he had specially delivered, absorbing news from the wider world that seemed to have forgotten his existence. After lunch, more reading. He devoured everything. Philosophy, science, travel literature, novels. His apartment was filled with books, stacked on every surface, annotated in his cramped handwriting. Busts of Kant and Goethe watched over his work. A portrait of his father hung on the wall, that troubled man whose fate Arthur feared he might share. In the late afternoon came another walk, this time longer, through the parks and along the river. His poodle, whom he called either Atma or Butts, depending on the particular dog, accompanied him faithfully. He spoke to the dog constantly. He was said to address it as Sir in moments of particular respect. These poodles, a succession of them over the decades, were his most constant companions. He preferred their company to that of human beings. Evenings were for the theatre or the opera when something worthy was being performed. He had strong opinions about music, considering it the highest of the arts, the most direct expression of the will itself. He could not tolerate mediocre performances. He walked out of many. Then home to read until 10, always 10, when he retired to bed. Beside that bed, loaded and ready, sat a pair of pistols. Arthur Schopenhauer slept armed against intruders he was certain would some day come. He hid his gold coins in different locations throughout the apartment. concealed his financial records in false bottom drawers, and trusted no one with knowledge of his affairs. The paranoia that had consumed his father had found a home in the sun. This was the external life, the routine visible to his Frankfurt neighbours. But within those cramped rooms, something else was happening. The hermit was not idle. The decades of obscurity were not empty. Arthur Schopenhauer was still thinking, still writing, still developing the philosophy that the world refused to read. He was exploring territories that Western philosophy had never seriously engaged. He was reading Hindu scriptures, the Upanishads, finding in them confirmation of his own insights about the illusory nature of individual existence. He was studying Buddhist texts and recognizing in their analysis of desire and suffering a parallel to his own concept of the will. He was building bridges between East and West that would not be widely crossed for another century. He was also refining his ideas about art, about ethics, about the possibility of escape from the endless striving of the will. He was writing essays that would eventually be collected and published. He was annotating new editions of his masterpiece, adding material, clarifying arguments, responding to objections that no one had actually raised because no one was reading him. The world saw a bitter hermit walking his dog through Frankfurt's parks. But in his cramped apartment, surrounded by books in half a dozen languages and busts of Kant and Goethe, Schopenhauer was conducting an experiment no Western philosopher had attempted before. He was creating a systematic synthesis of European metaphysics and Eastern spiritual insight that would eventually influence everyone from Nietzsche to Freud. And his next published work would reveal a mind growing darker, more radical, and more dangerous. To understand why Arthur Schopenhauer matters, to grasp why his ideas would eventually reshape psychology, influence art, and challenge the foundations of Western optimism, we must pause in our story and descend into the depth of his philosophy itself. What had this man actually discovered during his years of solitary labour? What was the insight that he believed would change the world? The insight that the world seems so determined to ignore. It begins with Kant. The great philosopher of Königsberg had demonstrated that we do not perceive reality as it truly is. Our minds impose structure on experience. Space and time, cause and effect. These are not features of the world itself, but categories through which we organize our perceptions. The world as it appears to us, the world of objects and events, Kant called the phenomenal world. Behind it lies the noumenal world, the thing in itself, which remains forever inaccessible to human knowledge. Kant had declared this barrier absolute. We cannot know what reality is in itself because all our knowledge is filtered through the structures of our perceiving minds. The thing in itself is a necessary concept, but an empty one. Schopenhauer disagreed. We do have access to the thing in itself, he argued, but not through perception or reason. We have access to it through our own bodies, through the immediate experience of willing. When you move your arm, you do not first perceive the arm moving, and then infer that you willed it. The willing and the movement are one. Your body is the will made visible. It is the thing in itself manifested in the world of appearance, and what is true of your body is true of everything. The entire universe, Schopenhauer claimed, is the manifestation of will. Not will in the sense of conscious intention, but will as a blind, purposeless striving that underlies all existence. Every force of nature, from gravity to magnetism to the growth of plants, is the will expressing itself at different levels. Every animal instinct, every human desire, every passion and drive is a manifestation of this same fundamental force. This was a radical claim. It meant that the distinction between mind and matter, so central to Western philosophy, was an illusion. It meant that the separation between self and world, between subject and object, was merely a feature of how we perceive, not of how things truly are. At the deepest level, we are all expressions of a single, unified will. But here was the insight that earned Schopenhauer his reputation as a pessimist, and here was the reason the world was so reluctant to hear him. The will is never satisfied. It strives endlessly, achieving momentary goals only to generate new desires. It is like a hunger that can never be filled, a thirst that can never be quenched. Every satisfaction gives way to new wanting. Every achievement reveals new lacks. The will is, by its very nature, insatiable. Human life, therefore, is not a journey toward happiness. It is an oscillation between two forms of suffering. When we want something and cannot have it, we suffer from frustrated desire. When we obtain what we wanted, we suffer from boredom, from the emptiness that follows satisfaction, until new desires arise to torment us again. There is no escape within the normal terms of human life. The will has us trapped. This was what the world did not want to hear. Schopenhauer was not offering comfort. He was not telling people that things would work out, that progress was real, that their lives had ultimate meaning. He was saying that existence itself is structured for suffering, that the universe is not rational but blind, that the self we cherish is an illusion, and that even our highest aspirations are merely the will deceiving itself. And yet his philosophy was not mere despair. Schopenhauer also described paths of escape, temporary and permanent. Art, especially music, offers temporary liberation by allowing us to contemplate the world without desire, to see without wanting. Ethical compassion breaks down the illusion of separation between self and other, recognizing that the same will suffers in all beings, and for the rare few, a complete denial of the will, a renunciation that he found expressed in the lives of saints and mystics both East and West, offers the only true escape from the wheel of desire and suffering. This was not a philosophy for the comfortable. It was not a philosophy that universities would rush to teach or that governments would embrace. It attacked the foundations of the optimistic worldview that dominated 19th century Europe. It said that the entire project of progress and improvement was built on an illusion, and perhaps that is why it was ignored for so long. Perhaps that is why Hegel's vision of rational history progressing toward freedom proved so much more popular. People want to believe that things are getting better. They want to believe that their suffering serves a purpose. Schopenhauer offered no such comfort. He offered only the cold clarity of seeing things as they are. Schopenhauer believed he had described the truth of human existence more accurately than any philosopher before him. But truth, he was discovering, is not always welcome. His ideas about women would make him notorious. His ideas about compassion would make him prophetic. And his ideas about the denial of the will would inspire artists, psychologists, and nihilists for generations to come. The question was whether anyone would listen before he died. In 1851, Arthur Schopenhauer published a collection of essays and aphorisms titled Parerga and Paralipomena. The title, meaning additions and omissions, suggested minor supplementary works, footnotes to his main philosophical system. Among these essays was one that would make him infamous, on women. The essay is difficult to read today. It argues that women are intellectually inferior to men, incapable of producing great art or philosophy, naturally suited to submission and domesticity. It claims that women are essentially childlike, living in the present moment, unable to grasp abstract principles. It suggests that the institution of monogamous marriage is an unnatural imposition that goes against the biological interests of men. It is, by any modern standard, a document of hatred. Schopenhauer did not hide behind qualification or nuance. He stated his views with the same blunt force he brought to all his philosophical pronouncements. Women, he wrote, exist for the propagation of the species. Their charms are nature's trick to ensure that men will reproduce. Behind the veil of romantic love is the will, blindly pursuing its goal of continuing life, using human beings as its instruments. How do we reckon with this? One approach is biographical. Arthur Schopenhauer's life had been shaped by his relationship with women, and that shaping had been almost entirely negative. His mother had rejected him, first emotionally and then completely. She had chosen her salon, her literary career, her social life over her son. She had told him explicitly that she could not bear his presence. She had pushed him down a flight of stairs. His romantic life had been a series of failures. He had fathered a child with a servant in his youth, a child who died in infancy, a relationship conducted with no apparent emotional engagement. He had proposed marriage at least once and been rejected. He had visited prostitutes. He had never formed a lasting intimate partnership with anyone. And then there was Caroline Marquet, the seamstress he had thrown down the stairs, the woman whose quarterly pension was a constant reminder of his capacity for violence against a female body. It would be too simple to say that Schopenhauer hated women because his mother had rejected him, but it would be naive to ignore the connection entirely. The philosophy of a thinker cannot be entirely separated from the life of the person who created it. The essay On Women reads, in places less like philosophy than like revenge, a settling of scores with an entire gender for the wounds inflicted by specific individuals. But there is another layer to the problem. Schopenhauer's views on women were also connected to his broader philosophy in ways that cannot be dismissed as mere personal pathology. If the will is the fundamental reality, and if the primary manifestation of the will in human life is the drive to reproduce, then women, as the essential partners in reproduction, become in his system instruments of the will's blind purpose. His misogyny was not just prejudice grafted onto philosophy, it was woven into the fabric of his system. This does not make it any less repugnant. It does make it more complicated. We are faced with a thinker whose insights into human psychology and metaphysics remain profound, whose influence on subsequent thought is undeniable, and whose views on half of humanity were contemptible. The two cannot be easily separated. They coexist in the same mind, the same books, the same philosophical system. Schopenhauer's essay on women found readers who embraced it enthusiastically. It gave intellectual cover to misogyny. It was cited by those who opposed women's education, women's suffrage, women's participation in public life. It contributed to a philosophical tradition that treated women as objects rather than subjects, as instruments rather than ends. It also provoked opposition, then and now, feminist. Philosophers have dissected his arguments and found them wanting on their own terms. His claims about women's intellectual inferiority were already being disproven by women writers, scientists and thinkers in his own era. His biological determinism looks increasingly untenable in light of everything we have learned about the cultural construction of gender. Schopenhauer's views on women would make him a hero to some and a villain to others, but his essay on ethics, published in the same collection, would reveal something unexpected. A philosophy of compassion so profound that even his harshest critics would struggle to dismiss it. The same man who despised half of humanity also understood, perhaps better than anyone, why suffering demands our response. Here is the strangest thing about Arthur Schopenhauer. The misanthrope, the hermit, the man who could not maintain relationships and who wrote with contempt about women, also developed one of the most compelling arguments for compassion in the history of Western philosophy. The question of ethics had preoccupied philosophers for millennia. What makes an action right or wrong? What is the foundation of morality? The traditional answers pointed to divine command, to rational duty, to social contract, to the greatest good for the greatest number. Schopenhauer found all of these answers inadequate. Divine command theory, he argued, makes morality arbitrary. If something is good only because God commands it, then morality has no independent foundation. Kant's rational duty, with its categorical imperative to act only according to principles you could will to be universal laws, was too abstract, too removed from actual human experience. Utilitarianism's calculations of pleasure and pain miss something essential about why we actually respond to the suffering of others. Schopenhauer proposed a different foundation. Compassion itself, morality, he argued, does not come from reason or calculation. It comes from the direct experience of another being suffering. when we truly perceive the pain of another creature, when we feel it as if it were our own, we are moved to action not by principle, but by immediate recognition. This is compassion, and it is the only genuine source of moral behaviour. But why do we feel compassion? Here Schopenhauer's metaphysics provided the answer. If the will is the fundamental reality, if the distinction between self and other is merely a feature of the phenomenal world, then at the deepest level there is no separation between your suffering and mine. Compassion is the experience of this truth breaking through the illusion of individuality. When I feel your pain, I am recognizing, if only dimly, that we are not truly separate, that the same will suffers in both of us. This insight had radical implications. If compassion is the foundation of ethics, and if the suffering of all beings flows from the same source, then moral consideration cannot be limited to human beings. Animals suffer. Animals are manifestations of the same will. Animals deserve our compassion. Schopenhauer became one of the first major Western philosophers to argue seriously for the moral status of animals. He condemned vivisection as a moral atrocity. He criticized the casual cruelty with which human beings treated other creatures. He saw in the suffering of animals the same will that suffers in us, deserving of the same moral response. This was not a minor addendum to his philosophy. It was a direct consequence of his metaphysics, and it placed him far ahead of his time. The animal rights movement that would emerge in the 20th century would find in Schopenhauer a philosophical forefather. Peter Singer, the philosopher whose work has been most influential in modern animal ethics, explicitly acknowledged his debt. The paradox remains. The man who could describe the death of Caroline Marquet as a burden lifted, who wrote with such venom about women, who pushed people away and preferred the company of his dog, this same man understood something profound about the nature of compassion. He saw that true morality requires breaking through the illusion of the separate self. He saw that suffering calls to us across the boundaries of species and individuality. Perhaps the paradox is itself instructive. Perhaps it shows us that philosophical insight does not guarantee personal virtue, that understanding the truth is not the same as living it. Schopenhauer knew what compassion was. He could analyze it, describe it, argue for it, but knowing and doing are different things. The will, after all, does not obey reason. The philosopher of suffering had developed an ethics of compassion. The hater of women had articulated why all beings deserve moral consideration. The contradictions would never resolve, but the 1840s were ending, and Schopenhauer was about to witness events that would test every aspect of his philosophy. Revolution was coming to Europe, and the old pessimist would reveal whose side he was really on. In the spring of 1848, the old order of Europe began to crack. Revolution swept across the continent with a speed and fury that stunned kings and commoners alike. From Paris to Vienna, from Berlin to Rome, crowds poured into the streets demanding constitutional government, national self-determination, an end to the stifling autocracy that had prevailed since the defeat of Napoleon. In Frankfurt am Main, where Arthur Schopenhauer had lived quietly for nearly 2 decades, the revolution arrived in March. Citizens barricaded the streets. The German National Assembly convened in the city to draft a constitution for a united liberal Germany. The air was thick with hope and fear, with manifestos and gunpowder. One might expect a pessimist to be indifferent to these events. If human life is suffering, if progress is an illusion, if the will drives all of us blindly toward goals we do not choose, then what difference does it make who sits on the throne? The revolution should have been, from Schopenhauer's philosophical perspective, merely another manifestation of the same underlying futility. But Arthur Schopenhauer was not indifferent. He was furiously hostile to the revolutionaries. The reasons were partly personal. Schopenhauer was a man of property. He lived on the income from investments carefully managed since his father's death. Revolution threatened property. The mobs in the streets were calling for redistribution, for the overthrow of the social order that guaranteed his comfortable existence. The philosopher who had written about the illusory nature of the individual self was very much attached to his individual portfolio, but there was more to it than self-interest. Schopenhauer's philosophy, for all its radical metaphysics, led to deeply conservative political conclusions. If human beings are driven by a blind, irrational will, if reason is merely the servant of unconscious drives, then the Enlightenment faith in democratic self-governance is dangerous fantasy. The masses cannot be trusted to rule themselves. They are moved by passion, by manipulation, by the endless striving of the will. They are, in Schopenhauer's contemptuous phrase, the sovereign rabble. He watched the revolutionary crowds from his window and saw not the birth of freedom, but the unleashing of chaos. When government troops attempted to suppress the uprising, Schopenhauer offered what assistance he could. The most notorious story, reported by multiple sources, claims that he invited Austrian soldiers into his apartment and lent them his opera glasses so they could better aim at the revolutionaries in the street below. Whether this specific incident occurred exactly as reported is uncertain. What is not uncertain is Schopenhauer's attitude. He despised the revolution. He feared the mob. He saw in the liberal and democratic aspirations of 1848 nothing but the will deluding itself with pretty words about freedom and progress. This was not armchair philosophy. Schopenhauer genuinely feared for his safety during the revolutionary months. He locked his doors. He kept his pistols ready. He prepared for the possibility that the mob would turn on people like him, people of education and property who stood apart from the popular enthusiasm. His will, drafted during this period, left a significant portion of his estate to a fund supporting Prussian soldiers disabled in the suppression of the revolution and the families of soldiers killed in that service. It was a final gesture of contempt for the revolutionary cause, a statement of allegiance to order against chaos, to authority against the mob. The revolutions of 1848 failed across Europe. The old order survived. The constitutional assemblies were dissolved. The kings and princes retained their thrones. And Schopenhauer, now past 60, had given up hope that the world would ever read his philosophy. He agreed to one final effort, a collection of essays and aphorisms that he considered minor works, scraps from his table. He could not have known that this modest book would accomplish what his masterpiece never had. It would make him, at last, famous. For 30 years, Arthur Schopenhauer had waited. He had written his masterpiece at 30 and watched it sink into oblivion. He had challenged the academic establishment and been humiliated. He had retreated to Frankfurt and constructed a life of rigid routine, walking his dog, playing his flute, dining alone, waiting for a world that seemed determined never to arrive. In 1851, he published what he considered a minor work. He called it Parerga and Paralipomena, Greek words meaning roughly additions and omissions. It was, in his mind, a collection of supplementary essays, scattered thoughts, aphorisms and reflections that did not fit into his main philosophical system. It was the scraps from his table, the footnotes to his life's work. He had struggled to find a publisher. The manuscript had been rejected multiple times. His previous books had sold so poorly that no commercial house wanted to take the risk. Finally, a Berlin publisher agreed to print it, but only if Schopenhauer accepted no payment whatsoever. The philosopher of the will had to beg to give his work away. The book appeared in 2 volumes. It contained essays on a bewildering range of topics: the art of controversy, the nature of genius, the metaphysics of sexual love, advice on how to live, reflections on noise, thoughts on style, the infamous essay on women, and much else besides. Unlike his systematic masterpiece, these were accessible pieces, written in clear prose, addressing questions that ordinary educated readers could recognize from their own lives. And then something unexpected happened. People read it. The breakthrough came in the form of a review published in the Westminster Review, one of England's most prestigious intellectual journals. The reviewer, John Oxenford, was not a philosopher but a literary critic. He had stumbled upon Schopenhauer's work and been captivated. In April 1853, he published an essay titled Iconoclasm in German Philosophy that introduced Schopenhauer to the English-speaking world. Oxenford's review was enthusiastic, perceptive, and perfectly timed. Europe was ready for something new. The optimistic systems of Hegel and his followers had begun to feel stale, disconnected from the realities of industrial society and the failures of the 1848 revolutions. Here was a philosopher who spoke directly to the experience of modern life, who acknowledged suffering without pretending it served some higher purpose, who wrote with wit and style rather than impenetrable jargon. The review was translated into German and reprinted in newspapers across the continent. Suddenly, intellectuals who had never heard of Schopenhauer were seeking out his books. They read the Parerga first, finding in its accessible essays a doorway into his thought. Then they turned to The World as Will and Representation, the masterpiece that had gathered dust for 3 decades and discovered a philosophical system of extraordinary depth and power. The effect was remarkable. Within a few years, Schopenhauer went from complete obscurity to international celebrity. Universities that had ignored him began to teach his work. Young philosophers made pilgrimages to Frankfurt to meet the master. Portrait painters requested sittings. Newspapers reported on his daily routine. His books, after 30 years, finally began to sell. Arthur Schopenhauer was 63 years old when fame arrived. His hair had turned white. His health was declining. He had spent the prime of his life in isolation, convinced of his genius, waiting for recognition that seemed destined never to come. And now, impossibly, it had come. The letters poured in. Admirers from across Europe wrote to express their gratitude, their wonder, their sense that Schopenhauer had given voice to thoughts they had always felt but never articulated. Young men declared themselves his disciples. Established intellectuals acknowledged his influence. The world that had ignored him for 4 decades was suddenly at his door. How did he receive this belated triumph? With satisfaction, certainly. With vindication. He had always known he was right. He had always known the world would eventually recognize what he had achieved. The long years of obscurity had been, in his view, not his failure but the world's. Now the world was correcting its error, but there was bitterness too. His mother had died in 1838, never knowing that her despised son would become famous. His great rival Hegel remained enshrined in the universities, his system still taught, his reputation still immense. The academic establishment that had rejected Schopenhauer still controlled the institutions. He was celebrated now, but he was celebrated from outside, as an independent thinker who had never needed their approval. At 63 years old, Arthur Schopenhauer woke up famous. Letters arrived from admirers across Europe. Young philosophers made pilgrimages to Frankfurt to meet the master. Portrait painters requested sittings. Universities that had ignored him now offered honorary degrees. The Hermit of Frankfurt had become a celebrity. But fame, Schopenhauer discovered, solved nothing. His mother had died without reconciliation. His romantic life remained empty. His body was failing. He had won the battle of ideas. But what exactly had he won? They came to Frankfurt seeking wisdom. Young men with notebooks and nervous questions. Established scholars hoping to pay homage. Curious visitors who had read the essays and wanted to see the famous pessimist in person. Arthur Schopenhauer received them in his apartment, surrounded by his books and his busts and his latest poodle, holding court like a philosophical king finally restored to his throne. He called them his apostles and evangelists. The religious language was deliberate. Schopenhauer saw himself as the founder of a new dispensation, a prophet whose message had been rejected in his own country and his own time, but who would ultimately triumph. His disciples were the first believers, the ones who recognized the truth before the masses caught on. The most devoted was Julius Frauenstedt, a young philosopher who had discovered Schopenhauer's work in the early 1840s and been transformed by it. Frauenstedt attached himself to the master with an almost filial devotion. He visited Frankfurt regularly. He corresponded voluminously. He undertook the task of preparing new editions of Schopenhauer's works, correcting errors, adding indexes, making the philosophy more accessible to new readers. Schopenhauer received this devotion with a mixture of pleasure and suspicion. He enjoyed the flattery, he appreciated the practical help, but he also doubted whether Frauenstedt or any of his disciples truly understood what he had written. They were enthusiasts, but enthusiasm was not the same as comprehension. They admired the style, the aphorisms, the accessible essays. Did they grasp the depths of the metaphysics? Did they follow the argument about the will to its darkest conclusions? He tested them constantly. He asked probing questions. He pointed out errors in their interpretations. He could be generous with his time and knowledge, but he could also be cruel, dismissing attempts at originality, insisting that his system was complete and needed, no additions or modifications. The disciples learned to tread carefully. Other visitors came from the world of art and music. Richard Wagner, already celebrated as the most innovative composer in Germany, sent Schopenhauer a copy of the libretto for his Ring Cycle, with a dedication praising the philosopher's influence on his work. Wagner had discovered the world as will and representation in 1854 and been overwhelmed. Here was a philosophy that placed music at the centre of human experience, that saw in the art he practiced the highest form of metaphysical insight. Wagner would later claim that Schopenhauer was the greatest gift of his entire life. Schopenhauer was pleased by the attention but wary of the man. Wagner was too theatrical, too grandiose, too hungry for a personal relationship. The philosopher preferred admirers at a distance. He acknowledged the dedication politely but did not encourage further intimacy. He had lived too long alone to change now. The fame brought other complications. Schopenhauer became a tourist attraction. Visitors to Frankfurt sought him out at the Englischer Hof, watching him eat his dinner, observing his routine like naturalists studying an exotic specimen. He complained about the intrusion but also clearly enjoyed it. After decades of invisibility, being seen was its own reward, but the essential loneliness remained. The disciples came and went. The admirers sent their letters and occasionally appeared at his door. The portrait painters captured his image for posterity. None of it changed the fundamental structure of his life. He was still the hermit of Frankfurt, still walking the same streets with his poodle, still dining alone, still sleeping with pistols beside his bed. Recognition had come too late to transform him. The bitter young man who'd been rejected by his mother, humiliated at Berlin, ignored by the world for 30 years, that man had hardened into his final form long before fame arrived. He could receive the homage of disciples without being nourished by it. He could accept the world's belated recognition without being healed by it. The wound was too old and too deep. Among the young thinkers drawn to Schopenhauer's philosophy in those final years was a brilliant, troubled student of philology at the University of Bonn. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. He had discovered the world as will and representation in a used bookshop and read it in a fever of excitement. Schopenhauer had answered questions Nietzsche did not know he was asking, but the disciple would eventually surpass and repudiate the master in ways Schopenhauer could never have imagined. The fame changed nothing about how Arthur Schopenhauer lived his days. He rose at 7. He washed in cold water. He drank his coffee and sat at his desk. He played his flute at noon. He walked to the Englischer Hof for his dinner. He read the London Times. He walked his poodle in the afternoon. He attended the theatre when something worthy was playing. He retired at 10 with his loaded pistols beside him. The routine had been established decades earlier, and it would not bend to accommodate celebrity. Visitors who expected to find the famous philosopher holding salon, entertaining guests, engaging in the social rituals of intellectual life, were disappointed. Schopenhauer would receive them, answer their questions, sometimes warm to conversation, but he would not alter his schedule. The routine was not mere habit, it was architecture, the structure that held his life together. In these final years, he was productive in a quiet way. He prepared new editions of his works, adding prefaces, revising passages, responding to the criticism that was now, finally, being written about his philosophy. He corresponded with disciples and admirers, sometimes generously, sometimes with the cutting dismissiveness that had characterized his entire career. He read voraciously, as he always had, keeping up with developments in science and literature, annotating his books with comments that would not be published in his lifetime. His body was failing. Respiratory problems plagued him. He had difficulty breathing, especially at night. The long walks with his poodle grew shorter. The cold baths that he believed essential for health became harder to endure. He was 70 years old, then 71, then 72. The end was approaching, and he knew it. How does a philosopher face death when his philosophy teaches that individual existence is ultimately an illusion? Schopenhauer had argued that the self we cherish, the personality we believe ourselves to be, is merely a phenomenon, a temporary manifestation of the will. Death is not the annihilation of something real. It is the dissolution of an appearance, the return of the wave to the ocean from which it arose. This should have been comforting. The individual perishes, but the will endures. We are not truly separate beings who cease to exist. We are expressions of something larger that continues beyond our brief appearance. Death, understood properly, is nothing to fear. Did Schopenhauer believe his own consolation? The evidence is mixed. He maintained his philosophical positions to the end. He did not recant. He did not turn to religion or seek supernatural assurances. When visitors asked about his approaching death, he answered in terms consistent with his system. He had written the truth about existence. Death was simply the final confirmation of that truth, but the pistols remained beside his bed. The paranoia about intruders never abated. The fear of death, which he had analysed so brilliantly, continued to haunt his nights. Perhaps knowing the truth and feeling it were different things. Perhaps the will, which doesn't obey reason, still trembled at its own extinction, even while the intellect pronounced that extinction an illusion. He continued to work. He continued to receive visitors. He continued his routine with a discipline that bordered on the heroic. If these were not happy years, they were at least authentic ones. He had lived according to his own understanding. He had waited for recognition, and received it. He had maintained his positions against the pressure of an indifferent world. Whatever else could be said about Arthur Schopenhauer, he had not compromised. On the morning of September 21st, 1860, Arthur Schopenhauer's housekeeper found him sitting in his usual chair at the breakfast table. He was dead. The doctor determined that his heart had simply stopped, peacefully, without struggle. He was 72 years old. Philosopher who had spent his life contemplating suffering had, in the end, been spared it. But his real life, his afterlife in the minds of others, was just beginning. Arthur Schopenhauer was buried in Frankfurt's main cemetery. His grave was modest. His instructions had been simple. He wanted no religious ceremony, no elaborate monument, no pretense of believing what he did not believe. The atheist philosopher went into the ground without prayers. But even as his body returned to the earth, his ideas were spreading across Europe with a speed and intensity that would have astonished him. The thinker who had waited 40 years for recognition was about to become one of the most influential philosophers in history, and nowhere was that influence more profound than in the world of art. Richard Wagner had already acknowledged his debt, but the full impact of Schopenhauer on Wagner's work was only beginning to be felt. The operas that Wagner composed after his discovery of the world as will and representation were saturated with Schopenhauerian themes. Tristan and Isolde, completed in 1859, is essentially a musical dramatization of the philosophy of the will. The lovers yearn for union, for the dissolution of individual identity, for the peace that can only come when the will ceases its endless striving. The famous Liebestod, The love-death that concludes the opera is Schopenhauer set to music. Wagner was explicit about this connection. He wrote to friends describing his encounter with Schopenhauer as a spiritual awakening. He kept a copy of The World as Will and Representation beside him while composing. He saw his art as the realization of Schopenhauer's vision, the creation of a musical world in which the deepest truth about existence could be experienced directly. The influence spread beyond Wagner to an entire generation of European artists and writers. Leo Tolstoy read Schopenhauer obsessively in the years before writing War and Peace. He kept a portrait of the philosopher on the wall of his study. The philosophical digressions in his great novel, the reflections on history and free will, and the forces that move human events bear the unmistakable imprint of Schopenhauerian thought. Tolstoy's later turn toward asceticism and the renunciation of worldly desire was another form of living out the philosopher's conclusions. Thomas Mann, writing in the early 20th century, acknowledged Schopenhauer as a formative influence on his work. The brooding, pessimistic atmosphere of novels like Buddenbrooks, with their themes of decline and the futility of striving, could not have been written without Schopenhauer's shadow falling across the page. Mann called him the father of all modern psychology, recognizing that the analysis of unconscious motivation, of the gap between what we think we want and what actually drives us, began not with Freud, but with the Hermit of Frankfurt. Marcel Proust read Schopenhauer as a young man and carried his insights into the vast architecture of In Search of Lost Time. The novel's exploration of memory, desire, and the impossibility of possessing what we love owes much to the philosopher's analysis of the will and its inevitable frustrations. Samuel Beckett, whose plays and novels are monuments to the absurdity and suffering of existence, was another devoted reader. Jorge Luis Borges found in Schopenhauer's idealism a philosophical framework for his stories of labyrinths and mirrors and the unreality of the self. Why did artists respond so powerfully to this philosophy? Perhaps because Schopenhauer took art seriously. Unlike most philosophers, who treated aesthetic experience as a minor topic or a pleasant distraction, Schopenhauer placed art at the centre of human life. He argued that the greatest art allows us to escape temporarily from the tyranny of the will. In contemplating a beautiful painting or listening to a great symphony, we are freed from desire, freed from the endless cycle of wanting and frustration. We see the world without wanting anything from it. This is a kind of liberation, a foretaste of the peace that the saints and mystics find in permanent renunciation. Music, in particular, held a privileged place in his system. Unlike the other arts, which represent ideas that are themselves manifestations of the will, music represents the will directly. It is the voice of the thing in itself, speaking to us without mediation. This is why music moves us so deeply, why it seems to express something beyond words. Schopenhauer had given musicians and composers a philosophy that elevated their art to the highest possible status. Wagner called Schopenhauer's philosophy the greatest gift of his life. Tolstoy kept a portrait of Schopenhauer on his wall. Thomas Mann described him as the father of all modern psychology. But it was in the field of actual psychology that Schopenhauer's influence would prove most profound and most unacknowledged. A Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud would build an entire theory of the unconscious on foundations that Schopenhauer had laid half a century earlier. In the early 20th century, a new science was being born. It called itself psychoanalysis, and its founder was a Viennese physician named Sigmund Freud. The basic insight of this new science was revolutionary. Much of mental life is unconscious. We are driven by desires and memories that we cannot access directly, that influence our behaviour without our awareness, that make us strangers to ourselves. Freud presented this as a discovery, a scientific breakthrough achieved through clinical observation and careful reasoning. But readers familiar with Schopenhauer recognise something else. The ideas Freud was presenting as new had been articulated in remarkable detail half a century earlier by the pessimist of Frankfurt. The parallels are striking. Schopenhauer had argued that the intellect is the servant of the will, that reason does not guide our actions but rationalizes them after the fact. Freud said essentially the same thing about the relationship between the ego and the unconscious drives he called id. Schopenhauer had described how the will disguises itself, how we construct elaborate justifications for behavior that is actually driven by blind impulse. Freud called this repression and rationalization. Schopenhauer had explored the role of sexuality as the primary manifestation of the will in human life. Freud made sexuality the centerpiece of his entire system. Did Freud know he was following in Schopenhauer's footsteps? The question has been debated for decades. In his published writings, Freud acknowledged that Schopenhauer had anticipated some of his ideas. He claimed, however, that he had developed his theories independently and only later discovered the philosophical parallels. Some scholars have accepted this account. Others have pointed out that Schopenhauer was widely read in the intellectual circles Freud inhabited, that the philosophy was in the air Freud breathed, and that the influence may have been deeper and more pervasive than Freud wished to admit. What is not in doubt is the structural similarity between their visions of the mind. Both saw consciousness as a small, often self-deceived portion of mental life. Both saw the vast unconscious as the true driver of behavior. Both understood that reason is weak and desire is strong, that we are not the masters of our own souls, but servants of forces we barely comprehend. Carl Jung, who began as Freud's disciple before breaking with him to found his own school of psychology, drew even more directly on Schopenhauer. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, the idea that beneath individual psychology lies a shared reservoir of archetypes and symbols, echoes Schopenhauer's claim that the individual will is merely a manifestation of a universal will. Jung's interest in Eastern thought, in the mystical traditions that point toward the dissolution of the ego, follows paths that Schopenhauer had already explored. The influence extended beyond psychoanalysis into the broader currents of 20th century thought about the mind. When cognitive scientists today study the ways in which unconscious processes shape perception and decision-making, when behavioral economists demonstrate the irrational biases that distort our choices, when evolutionary psychologists trace our behavior back to drives that served our ancestors on the African savannah, they're working in a tradition that Schopenhauer helped to found. He was not a scientist. He did not conduct experiments or gather data, but he saw something that the optimistic, rationalist tradition of Western philosophy had overlooked or denied. He saw that we are not primarily rational beings. He saw that beneath the surface of conscious thought lies a vast, dark, powerful realm that shapes everything we do. He saw that the ego is not the master of its own house. This insight, articulated in the language of metaphysics a generation before Darwin and 2 generations before Freud, would prove to be one of the most consequential ideas in modern intellectual history. It changed how we understand ourselves. It changed art, literature, psychology, and philosophy. It is still changing how we think about what it means to be human. Freud, Jung, the entire tradition of depth psychology, all of it carries Schopenhauer's fingerprints. But the philosopher who would engage most deeply with Schopenhauer's legacy was the young philologist who discovered him in that used bookshop. Friedrich Nietzsche would take Schopenhauer's diagnosis of existence and reject his cure. He would transform pessimism into something new, and in doing so would shape the entire course of modern philosophy. In the autumn of 1865, a 21-year-old student of classical philology was browsing in a used bookshop in Leipzig. He was not looking for philosophy. He was supposed to be studying ancient Greek texts, preparing for an academic career in the analysis of language and literature. But something drew his hand to a battered copy of The World as Will and Representation. He opened it, began to read, and his life changed forever. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. Years later, Nietzsche would describe that moment in his autobiographical writings. He spoke of reading Schopenhauer in a fever of excitement, unable to put the book down, feeling as though every page had been written specifically for him. Here was a philosopher who told the truth about existence, who refused the comfortable lies of optimism and progress, who looked into the abyss and did not flinch. Nietzsche felt that he had found a teacher, a father figure, a spiritual guide. The influence was immediate and profound. Nietzsche's early works are saturated with Schopenhauerian themes. The Birth of Tragedy, his first major publication, drew directly on Schopenhauer's analysis of music and his vision of art as a response to the suffering of existence. The young philologist had become a philosopher, and the philosophy he practiced was unmistakably marked by the Hermit of Frankfurt. But discipleship, for a mind as powerful as Nietzsche's, could not last forever. As the years passed, Nietzsche began to see problems with his master's vision. Schopenhauer had diagnosed existence as suffering. He had traced that suffering to the insatiable striving of the will, and he had offered, as the highest wisdom, the denial of the will, the renunciation of desire, the quieting of the self that leads to a kind of peaceful extinction. This was the path of the saints and mystics, the path that Schopenhauer had found exemplified in Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Nietzsche came to see the solution as a betrayal. It was, he concluded, a form of life denial, a surrender to weakness, an admission of defeat. Schopenhauer had seen the truth about existence, but he had drawn the wrong conclusion. Instead of embracing life with all its suffering, instead of affirming existence in spite of its pain, he had counselled retreat. He had sided with death against life. The break, when it came, was decisive. Nietzsche developed his own concept of the will to power, a transformation of Schopenhauer's will that emphasized not blind striving but creative self-overcoming. He proclaimed the death of God and the need for humanity to create its own values. He imagined the Übermensch, the overman, who would embrace life fully, saying yes to existence even in its most terrible aspects. This was a direct repudiation of Schopenhauer's path. Where the master had counselled denial, the disciple proclaimed affirmation. Where Schopenhauer had valued compassion and the dissolution of the ego, Nietzsche celebrated strength and the creation of the exceptional individual. Where the older philosopher had looked to Eastern religions for wisdom, the younger turned to ancient Greece and the tragic affirmation of fate. And yet the repudiation was also a continuation. Nietzsche could not have become Nietzsche without first passing through Schopenhauer. The diagnosis remained even as the prescription changed. Nietzsche agreed that existence is suffering. He agreed that the universe is not rational. He agreed that conventional morality is a construction, not a discovery. He simply refused the resignation that his master had embraced. In a sense, Nietzsche completed Schopenhauer's work by betraying it. He took the unflinching honesty, the refusal of comfortable illusions, the willingness to stare into the darkness, and he forged from these materials something new. Schopenhauer had said no to the will. Nietzsche said yes to life. Both answers emerged from the same terrible clarity about what life actually is. The relationship between them became one of the great philosophical dramas of the modern era. Nietzsche wrote about Schopenhauer throughout his career, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with contempt, always with the intensity of a son struggling to escape his father's shadow. He needed Schopenhauer in order to become himself. He needed to kill his master in order to truly live. Nietzsche's fame eventually eclipsed Schopenhauer's. Today, Nietzsche is far more widely read, more frequently cited, more central to philosophical education. But every time someone speaks of the unconscious drives beneath rational thought, of the illusions we construct to make life bearable, of the fundamental irrationality of the human animal, they are speaking Schopenhauer's language. The master lost the battle but won something more enduring. For more than a century after his death, Arthur Schopenhauer's reputation was shadowed by a single word: pessimism. It was used to dismiss him, to warn students away from his work, to suggest that reading him was an indulgence in morbid gloom. Serious philosophers, it was implied, did not wallow in such negativity. They built constructive systems. They offered hope. But in recent decades, something has shifted. Scholars have returned to Schopenhauer with fresh eyes, and what they have found is not mere gloom, but something far more interesting. A form of philosophical realism that speaks directly to contemporary experience. Consider what modern psychology has discovered about human happiness. Researchers have documented what they call hedonic adaptation, the tendency of human beings to return to a baseline level of satisfaction, regardless of changes in their circumstances. Win the lottery, and within a year, studies show, you will likely be no happier than before, suffer a terrible loss, and, for most people, happiness levels eventually recover. We're on a treadmill, running hard but never arriving. Schopenhauer described exactly this mechanism 150 years before the research was conducted. The will, he argued, is insatiable by nature. Satisfy one desire and another arises. Achieve one goal and new goals appear. Happiness is not a destination but an illusion. A carrot dangled before us by a will that cares nothing for our satisfaction, only for our continued striving. Consider what behavioral economists have learned about decision-making. We are not the rational actors that classical economics assumed. We are subject to systematic biases, to predictable irrationalities, to a gap between what we think we want and what actually drives our choices. The elegant models of rational self-interest turn out to be fictions. Something else is running the show. Again, Schopenhauer was there first. The intellect, he insisted, is the servant of the will, not its master. We do not reason our way to our desires. We desire first and reason afterward, constructing justifications for choices that were made below the threshold of consciousness. The rational self is a performance, a story we tell ourselves about ourselves. The truth is darker and stranger. Consider what evolutionary psychology has revealed about human motivation. Our drives, our fears, our patterns of attraction and aversion, these were shaped not by reason but by millions of years of natural selection. We are designed not for happiness but for reproduction, not for understanding but for survival. The will that Schopenhauer described, blind and purposeless, striving only to continue its own existence, sounds remarkably like the selfish gene that modern biology has placed at the centre of life. What does it mean that a philosopher writing in the 1840s anticipated insights that would only be confirmed by science in the 20th and 21st centuries? It suggests that Schopenhauer was not indulging in morbid speculation, but observing something real about the human condition. His pessimism was not a mood, but a method, a refusal to accept comfortable fictions, a commitment to seeing clearly even when clarity was painful. This is why Schopenhauer is being rediscovered today. In an age of performative positivity, of social media carefully curated to display only happiness and success, of self-help books promising fulfillment through the right techniques, his honesty feels almost radical. He refused to pretend. He refused to offer false comfort. He described human life as it actually is, with all its frustration and disappointment and inevitable loss. This is not nihilism. Schopenhauer did not conclude that nothing matters. He concluded that compassion matters, that art matters, that the recognition of our shared suffering can become the foundation for ethics. His pessimism about the possibility of lasting happiness was paired with a profound seriousness about how we should treat one another in the midst of our common predicament. Schopenhauer spent his life insisting that honest pessimism was preferable to dishonest optimism. 200 years later, in an age of social media performance and relentless positivity culture, his message feels more urgent than ever. But there remains one final question about this strange, brilliant, difficult man. The question of what he was really like. Not the philosopher, the person. We have followed Arthur Schopenhauer through 7 decades of life. We have watched him struggle with his mother, flee from commerce, discover philosophy, create a masterpiece, suffer humiliation, retreat into solitude, and finally taste the fame he had craved for so long. But who was he really? What was it like to meet him, to talk with him, to exist in his presence? The accounts from those who knew him paint a picture of startling contradictions. He could be charming. Visitors who expected a gloomy misanthrope sometimes found instead a witty conversationalist, full of anecdotes and sharp observations, capable of genuine warmth when he chose to deploy it. He had read everything. He had travelled widely in his youth. He could discuss literature, science, music, politics, the customs of foreign nations. When he was in the mood, he was excellent company, but the mood could change without warning. He was capable of sudden rudeness, of cutting remarks delivered with a cruelty that seemed almost theatrical. He could not tolerate stupidity or pretension. He could not hide his contempt for those he considered intellectual inferiors, which was almost everyone. Conversations that began pleasantly could end with the visitor being dismissed like a servant who had failed to polish the silver. His relationship with money was peculiar. He had inherited a comfortable fortune from his father, and he managed it with obsessive care throughout his life. He counted every coin. He tracked every expenditure. He was terrified of poverty despite having no realistic prospect of experiencing it. When he died, he left a substantial estate, far more than he had ever needed, accumulated through decades of anxious frugality. And yet he left most of that estate to charity. His will directed that the bulk of his fortune go to a fund supporting Prussian soldiers disabled in the line of duty and the widows and orphans of those killed. It was a strange bequest from a philosopher who had written about the illusion of the individual self and the universality of suffering. Perhaps he saw in wounded soldiers a manifestation of the very suffering he had spent his life analysing. Perhaps it was his final act of compassion, delayed until he no longer needed the money himself. His love for his dogs was genuine and touching. The succession of poodles that shared his life, all named either Atma, a Sanskrit word for world soul, or Buts, received more consistent affection than any human being ever did. He walked with them daily. He spoke to them constantly. He mourned them when they died. In his will, he made provisions for the care of his final poodle, ensuring that the dog would be looked after when he was gone. The pistols by his bed spoke to the paranoia that had haunted him since youth, the same paranoia that had consumed his father. He trusted no one entirely. He was convinced that enemies were watching, that thieves were plotting, that the world bore him ill will. This was not entirely irrational. He had been ignored and rejected for decades, but the intensity of his suspicion went beyond what circumstances warranted. It was part of him, woven into his character, inseparable from the brilliance. His daily routine, maintained for decades with almost mechanical precision, was perhaps his greatest achievement of the will he claimed to understand so well. Rising at the same hour, writing at the same desk, walking the same paths, dining at the same restaurant, year after year, decade after decade. It was the structure that held him together, the discipline that allowed him to survive the solitude he had chosen. Without it, he might have dissolved entirely. He died as he had lived, alone. The housekeeper found him sitting upright in his chair. His heart had simply stopped. There was no struggle, no suffering, no dramatic final words. The philosopher of pessimism had been granted an easy death, a small mercy from a universe he had described as fundamentally indifferent to human welfare. Arthur Schopenhauer was cruel to a seamstress, contemptuous of women, and suspicious of nearly everyone. He was also one of the most honest philosophers who ever lived, honest about suffering, honest about the illusions of the ego, honest about the limits of reason. He was a difficult man with a difficult message. Perhaps it is fitting that the world took so long to hear him. We began this journey in a Frankfurt apartment, surrounded by letters from admirers who had finally discovered what Arthur Schopenhauer had known for 40 years. We watched an old man receive the recognition he had craved since youth, and we asked how someone could wait so long while remaining so certain. Now we have our answer. He waited because he had no choice. The world was not ready for what he had to say. He remained certain because the certainty was part of him, woven into his character as deeply as his paranoia and his love for his dogs. He could not have doubted his own genius any more than he could have stopped breathing. But we have also seen the cost of that certainty. The broken relationship with his mother never healed. The violence against Caroline Marquet never truly regretted. The empty classroom at Berlin, the decades of isolation, the pistols by the bed. Arthur Schopenhauer paid for his philosophy with his life. Whether the payment was worth it is a question each reader must answer for themselves. What remains is the work. The world as will and representation still sits on library shelves around the world, still being read by students who discover in its pages a description of existence more honest than anything they have encountered before. The essays of Parerga and Paralipomena still offer wisdom about how to live, how to think, how to see through the illusions that make life bearable and unbearable at once, and the influence continues to ripple outward. Every time a therapist helps a patient understand the unconscious forces shaping their behaviour, Schopenhauer is present. Every time a novelist explores the gap between what characters say they want and what actually drives them, his insight is at work. Every time a musician creates something that seems to speak directly to the depths of human experience, bypassing language entirely, they are proving what he claimed about the nature of music. He lies buried in Frankfurt's Main cemetery, his grave still visited by those who have been moved by his work. The inscription is simple. It does not try to summarize the philosophy or celebrate the achievement. It merely marks the place where Arthur Schopenhauer's body was returned to the earth. But the earth was never where he truly lived. He lived in ideas, in the realm of thought that transcends individual existence. He believed that the separation between people is an illusion, that beneath the surface of our separate selves lies a single will expressing itself in countless forms. If he was right, then his death was merely the withdrawal of one temporary manifestation. The will that spoke through him continues to speak through all of us. If you have found something of value in this story, I would be grateful if you would consider subscribing to The Long Shadow. We bring history's most compelling figures back to life every week, exploring the lives that shaped our world. And I am curious, what surprised you most about Arthur Schopenhauer? Let me know in the comments below. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that the highest wisdom was the clear-eyed acceptance of life as it is, not as we wish it to be. He spent 40 years in obscurity waiting for the world to accept this message. In the end, the world came to him. Whether we can accept his message, whether we even should, remains our choice to make. But the question he posed still echoes. Are we brave enough to see clearly? Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. Until our next exploration, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.